friends, this is Trish, and welcome to Teacher Therapy. Today we have a very special guest named Quentin, and he is going to help us understand what is wrong with modern education. We're going to talk about where modern educational philosophies are missing the mark, how this is showing up in teacher education programs and professional developments, and ultimately how all of these wrong philosophies are showing up in the classroom and creating out-of-control student behavior. Quentin taught for 9 years, and he has decided to leave the classroom, and he's going to tell us more. So let's go ahead and get started, Quentin. Can you kind of tell us, did your teacher education program prepare you well?
I think the short answer is no. And I think that I did a master's program. It was a year-long master's program at Ithaca College back in 2012 and 2013. And I think that what I experienced in that program did not prepare me for the conditions on the ground, so to say. The conditions on the ground were just so atrocious that I could never be prepared by the coursework that I was given in college. But to go back, the ed school experience really kind of primes teachers for what I really believe is these pseudo-scientific philosophies that really confuse teachers and lead to a lot of the problems that we see in the schools in terms of behavior. So just as an example, let's just start with one, student-driven. You know, I think that when I was in ed school, a lot of the coursework is aimed at kind of really hammering away at this idea that instruction really shouldn't be in this traditional model, because that's what they end up doing is they attack kind of the lecture. They say that teacher talk should be minimized. You know, they're really kind of going at what people might think of as teaching, and they say, no, that's not actually what teaching is. Teaching is put them in small groups, get the students to kind of work on the curriculum and see what the students want to learn. And so my ed school experience really kind of started with that, where you're seeing a lot of these ideas in the philosophy kind of coming to fruition in terms of all the trends that have been taking over K-12 education for many, many years.
Definitely. So what was it like in your first year of teaching? You've kind of been filled with all of these ideas of what works, that teachers are the guide on the side and not the sage on stage. Like, what did that look like when you actually got into the classroom your first year?
Well, it was a lot of chaos. And then I think that I was blamed for that chaos. You know, it was always classroom management, and it would always come back to me. Like, what are you doing as a teacher that's making it so chaotic? And I was so new and green that I didn't realize that these were bigger problems than me, but it was all getting put on me. So, you know, it could always be something small, like, oh, maybe it's your classroom organization, maybe try this, try that. And you would keep trying different things, and the student behavior was just so bad that it didn't really matter what you tried or implemented, as they say. It just wouldn't work. One of the things in my first year that really got to me that I hadn't seen was the block scheduling. It was 90 minutes. And 90 minutes is a long time for anyone to focus. And for these 10th graders who really were, for lack of a better word, illiterate. And I'm not trying to attack my students. I'm really just trying to say that they really could not read, or they would not read. It didn't matter which way, but even with the smallest lesson, it was such outright refusal to work or read that it wouldn't matter what kind of lesson I had. It wouldn't happen. The reading wouldn't happen. So then I would be stuck in a classroom with really horrible behavior for 90 minutes. And I was just at a loss. I'm like, I don't know what to do with these kids. I would even try to show a movie. They wouldn't even quiet down for the movie. And so at that point, I was like, what did I get myself into?
Kind of paint a picture for us about what a day in the life of your classroom would look like.
Well, a lot of immature behavior for when I was working with 9th and 10th graders, their behavior was much more, you know, akin to like a 7-year-old's behavior, an 8-year-old's behavior, you know, refusal to sit down, wandering the class, you know, refusing to participate in any meaningful way in any sort of lesson. So wandering, I had kids taking the textbook pages and folding them into origami, you know, stuff like that. And then it would be borderline violent at times too. I did have a desk thrown at me at one point early on. And it just was like a lot of those kind of situations where it's very unpredictable. I think teachers, when they go into the classroom, I think unfortunately with what's happening nowadays with the behavior, it's just unpredictable. You don't know what's going to happen next. It could be something crazy like that. And so when that desk was thrown at me, I was like, what have I gotten myself into? I was like, what was this career choice? You know, and it was right away from the very minute I stepped foot into a classroom. And I was very excited to teach too, after all of the expectations, all of the student teaching that I did, all of the observations. I was like, finally, I get to just teach. But the second I get into the classroom, it's such chaos that I'm like, wow, I can't teach because it's so crazy in here. And I wasn't expecting that kind of reaction from these students who really just gave me a hard time the whole time. again, I'm not trying to blame the students. I think that the student behavior is coming from deeper problems within education. But on the surface, what you see is just students who don't know what the process of school is, and again, I wouldn't say maybe it's because of all these philosophies and strategies that we're trying to use, but these students really struggle. At first, when I was back in 2013 in my first teaching position, the students struggled with just managing themselves in a classroom.
Definitely. And I think the hard part is when teachers get into this position, because I've had the same thing happen to me. I was told, build a relationship with them. Or I was asked, well, what do you think you're doing wrong that's causing the students to act that way? Did you have any kind of unhelpful advice like that thrown at you?
Oh, 100%. From the very minute I started, there were consultants, just always like, oh, did you try this? Did you try that? And someone always has an opinion. And that's one of the things about education that just gets to me is like everyone has an opinion about you, about your teaching, about what you're doing. And then at the same time, you have all of this chaos around you and they're basically blaming you. I was put on a corrective action plan and it just was like, at the time I was like having an identity crisis because I was like, man, I guess I just really can't teach. Like, I don't know what I'm doing. This is very confusing. When I realize now they were just blaming me for what were really systemic problems, I think.
Definitely. And let's talk a little bit about the curriculum. I've had a lot of different experiences. Some places I've gone into, they've thrown me to the wolves and said, you do your thing, you're free. Other places have had kind of canned curriculums that you have to follow by the letter. What was your experience in teaching your first year?
Well, I think I came to the understanding that a lot of what teaching is finding new material. You're always looking for material to engage students. So, when you're looking for a curriculum, you're looking for something that you can work with and do with your students. So what I did was I relied on my supervisor early on. I was like, what lessons do you have for ELA? Because I was an ELA teacher. I was like, what lessons do you have? And I remember very specifically at the beginning of this school year, they were giving me lessons from kind of old, what I could call outdated curriculum. And they were de-emphasizing textbooks already. From the very beginning I started, they were like, no, you can't rely on the textbook. Now, for me as a new teacher, I wanted to rely on the textbook because I thought that kind of anchors everything, right? But they're very, I think, anti-textbook. I think that's one of the trends as well in modern K-12 education is they're like anti-book, really, almost. So instead, I was doing these kind of one-off lessons. And you're always being told you need to make it project-based, you need to make it small groups, whatever. So the curriculum really for ELA is I would have maybe a story like we did the birds, I remember. And this is a very telling example. So the birds is a very old story from like the 40s. And then it was made into a movie in the 60s. The lesson that I was given and I tried to implement it with these kids, had like theme about the story. And it's kind of interesting. It's just like an basic ELA lesson about the meaning in the story. These kids didn't read a single paragraph of it. Like I had no idea what to do because I was just like, they will not read this. So the curriculum was already faltering. And so that's when I was like, well, maybe I'll show the movie. Big mistake. It's a movie from the 60s. Why would these kids want to watch it? But it was just like a lack of engagement with what I was given as curriculum. And I was really at a loss as to what to teach in terms of, because I would look at the textbook, I'd be like, oh, here's another example. There's Angela's Ashes, another interesting story book. And I was like, maybe I can get them engaged through this story. And it was just like, nope. Every story I'd pull out, everything, it'd be like a bag of tricks. I'd be like, what about this one? What about that one? And it'd be like, I love this story. They wouldn't read it. And it would just be like fighting constantly to find material. And ultimately what I found was nothing was working. The kids weren't reading any of it. And so here I was, I was in this room with these kids for a long time and they wouldn't do the ELA.
Absolutely. And I think that's the flaw with modern education is because everything is placed on the teacher and the students have no responsibility and they know it. And so with all the emphasis on the teacher, there's nothing we can do. And I think, rewind even 40 years, kids wouldn't necessarily be able to get away with a full-scale mutiny like that. Like the whole class couldn't just decide, well, we're not going to do this teacher's work. We're not going to listen. We're not going to pay attention because there would be consequences in place. They would fail. But I think there's so much pressure too on teachers today to have data and have scores and to pass everyone that even if we were to grade students honestly, you could have an administrator come in and change the grades, or you would be in trouble and they would say, well, why is everybody failing? So how did that part play out for you? Were you allowed to give their true grades? Did people fail? How did the whole data and grades conversation play out?
Well, when I first started, I wasn't, that was 12 years ago, and the standards-based grading wasn't really a thing. There were still grades, but already I was starting to see that the grades, if the students didn't work and I didn't have any work to grade, it was going to be hard for the grades to mean anything. And so I already started to see that. And at the same time, to kind of go back to your point about the professional expectations, it's the cognitive dissonance where teachers are expected to just bend over backwards and work till they die with professional expectations, and the harder that the teachers work, the less that the students work is what I would find. So, it's basically that learned helplessness, to put it, bluntly, where students, they are constantly, the bar keeps getting lowered, and so teachers are expected to kind of meet the students where they are. The problem is the kids in 10th grade are now reading at a 3rd grade level. So I am now supposed to take that responsibility and get these 10th graders the 10th graders who are really at 3rd grade to 10th grade somehow, so that they then get passed to 11th grade. And so what you can start to see is that when you pass everyone, which is ultimately what ends up happening, or most people, you don't really hold people back anymore, or students back anymore. So what you end up seeing is the students don't get the knowledge at the previous grade level, but they move on anyway, and the responsibilities on the higher level teacher to get those kids. So an 11th grade teacher has all this responsibility to get them at 11th grade curriculum. And it's unrealistic, because if that kid didn't get what they needed in the previous 10 grades, it's unfair to the teacher to expect them to get them to 11th grade. And that's why I really think that the entire gradation system is broken, because it truly is social promotion. What ends up happening is it's just an aging out. So the kid can get passed through all the years, not open a book, like literally not even open a book, and graduate. And I'm not saying all students do that, but I am saying that you see that behavior come out because students see, well, there's really no consequences for not doing the work, so why would I do it? And personally, I really believe that's just kind of basic human behavior. We work on deadlines, and if a kid doesn't have a deadline, they're not going to do it, because they really do see no point in it.
So there's been a lot of talk about social emotional learning and a lot of pressure put on teachers to kind of feel like a mini counselor in the classroom. When did you start to see that show up in your teaching career, and what were your thoughts on it?
So I really started to see that when I came back to New York after teaching for 5 years in Arizona. When I was in Arizona, I saw kind of glimpses of it early in like 2013, 2014, but it really wasn't until I came back and got a position here in the Finger Lakes in the Rochester region of New York that I began to see kind of a mix of all of these different trends, like SEL, personalized learning, kind of this like therapizing kind of idea of what K-12 education should be. And then really when I got my middle school position is when I saw it like a lot. Like SEL was everywhere, and it really didn't matter. At a certain point, it felt like my content knowledge didn't matter. It was like, oh yeah, you know something about ELA, but you need to implement an SEL curriculum. And I really believe that SEL curriculum is basically like a fancy way of saying character ed. I think that we are kind of creating a curriculum, and I even want to put that in quotes, because I don't think that's a curriculum. That's not content. That is what character education is like an attempt to make better people. But the issue with that, it's well-intentioned. I understand. It's like a well-intentioned thought. But the problem with that, well, there's a few problems with it. But firstly, it's not measurable. Like, it's not like content or knowledge where, oh, does the student know what photosynthesis is, or does the student not know? SEL is different because it's like you can't measure it in any kind of like objective sense necessarily. They'll claim they can. And that's where I see a lot of the professional development stuff. Like, they're basically making all these claims about what SEL is, what this can do for schools. And I really think it's almost ironic, because the more that you lean into those kind of ideas like SEL, the worse outcomes you get with students, because I think students just see right through it. Like, they feel like it's manipulative. They feel like it's not teaching them anything. And I really don't think it is. I think that a lot of it is just kind of misguided ideas about equity. And that word, again, a lot of these are kind of hot button topics. Even that word equity, I think, is kind of a hot button topic. But the way I see it being used, especially in education, is kind of like as this catch-all phrase that really doesn't define much. I feel like it's used to kind of further a lot of different people's agendas, but it's not there is no equity in schools. I think that there is still some serious problems that have been around since the beginning of integration in the 50s and 60s. White flight from, we get the city schools and the suburban schools, and that split between the two. I think we still see that to this day. I think certain city schools are just so anarchic and basically have become war zones because they're kind of almost abandoned. And then the suburban schools are the ones that survive and have resources. And so I do see, like, if you're going to talk about equity, like, I feel like people just say it. I really do. I think a lot of consultants, a lot of administrators just say the word equity and then they think they're good. They're like, oh, I said the word, so now we're good, even though every system that's in place is actually inequitable.
I totally agree. And I think it's so hard because whenever I've seen those terms show up, I feel like what it basically means is nobody can fail, everybody passes, nobody can have a negative consequence, everybody graduates, everybody gets an A. It's very bizarre because it'd be one thing if the students had the skills to produce those outcomes and they earned that. If we were putting all of our work on making sure that a student could genuinely pass a test and could genuinely meet certain metrics and standards, then I would say that's great. But it's almost like the Twilight Zone. It's like, no, we're just going to move the standard of what an A means down to like a D- standard. And look, you've got an A. And it's so insane and it's so insulting because what happens, I think, for a lot of these students that do have a severe lack of resources is now they can produce a paper that says, I have an A, I did great, but then they get into college and they fail out because they don't have any of the skills that would have required a real A.
Absolutely. So I just think that in terms of that idea that everyone, it's this all students have to pass. Inclusivity is the term that I think is used. And one of the biggest problems with inclusivity, like not as a concept, but more in terms of as it's applied to school, is that not everyone is going to be able to take calculus. Like if you have more advanced coursework, like there should be standards for being able to do that coursework. But if you just let everyone in, if there are really no standards of academic rigor, everyone says rigor, but like there's not really rigor. If there aren't any real standards, then what's going to happen is you're just trying to, cross off some boxes in a checklist. Like there is difficult coursework that really, when you get to 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade, if you've just passed people on into that harder coursework, they're going to fail. And it's not fair to them because they are now just a product of that system that is just pushing people through. And we won't be raising the bar of the academic rigor. Like kids won't be able to do calculus because they can't do basic arithmetic. They can't do basic algebra. But then to make these claims about how every student deserves a chance to do calculus, it's like, sure, that's a great idea, but on the ground, there have to be certain standards that say, well, this kid can't go on until they know what this means, or this kid can't move on until he can truly read. And that's why I think our gradation system, the social promotion just has to be, we have to put the brakes on it. Because if we don't, we don't have any measure of where the students are, and then it just becomes this mess. And so a lot of the behavioral issues that we're seeing are coming from this. A lot of it is just connected to this fact of it's well-meaning. I think a lot of it is well-intentioned that you want all students to succeed. And one of the things that I've done in my research in the past year and a half over it is that a lot of these people will claim they just want all students to succeed. And it's like, absolutely, we want all students to succeed, but that doesn't mean that they all will. Because if they don't take the initiative, if the students don't take the initiative to, up the ante, the teachers can only do so much. And that's why there's a teacher shortage, because teachers feel that they are put between a rock and a hard place with given students who don't have the skills, that the students that don't have the skills. And so it becomes the teacher's responsibility, as I was saying earlier, but it really should be on the student. So it's ironic because it's the trend is student driven. Everyone says student driven, personalize it. You gotta let the students have voice and choice. Oh my gosh, they have so many slogans. Voice and choice is one of those slogans where what I would argue that is truly is we're letting the amateurs fly the plane. The students are the amateurs. Okay. The teachers are actually the experts, but teachers are so not trusted to be the experts, that teachers are basically told, hey, minimize your teacher talk. Don't lecture about what you know. Listen to the students. Listen to what they have to say about your topic. And teachers rightly feel insulted by that, because it's like, what did I do all that certification for? What did I take all those tests for? What did I have all this experience for? And I just want to give one quick example of just how like prevalent this kind of idea is, that teachers aren't to be trusted or respected. When I was interviewing for a job up here in New York, I was driving around trying to find teaching work, and it was very difficult to find teaching work. I went to a school for an interview, and they put a Regents test on a clipboard, and they were like, here, take this test. We want to see how you do. This was so insulting to me, because it's like, I have 5 years of teaching experience. I have my certification in order. I had to re-up on my certification when I came back to New York. I had to drive to Utica to get a new certification. And here I am being told to take a test that a 10th grader takes, you know? So it was just like, don't you respect any of my expertise as a teacher? And ultimately, I think that the profession doesn't respect our expertise, because it's not about content knowledge. It's about making us into whatever they want to make us. Unfortunately, it turns us into like these weird therapist babysitters, you know, because the kids are so poorly behaved that the adult in the room can only do so much. But then it's all the responsibility is on the teacher. Like, you need to get them in control. You need to do this. You need to do that. You know, decorate your room. Like, they were so obsessed with like what I considered superficial things, like decorating your classroom, you know, put up a word wall. I'm thinking to myself, well, you want me to hang up all these posters, but like, they can't even read. What does it matter if there's a bunch of posters on the wall? You know, it just seems like such a superficial solution. And that's what I felt like I was getting a lot of the time from on high. It was just like, did you try greeting them at the door? It's like, you know, that's it. It would be great, but it doesn't change much. You know, it doesn't change the outrageous behavior that you would see.
Absolutely. Yeah, I kind of like the 80-20 rule. And the way I think of it is 80% of a student's success is a student doing the hard work of learning. Sometimes that is boring. Sometimes it includes memorization. Sometimes it includes reading for long stretches of time and writing and thinking. But it's as if the teaching industry just wiped all of that off the table and said, we're going to focus on the 20%, which is all optics and fun. And it looks like the students are talking and doing things with their hands. And that's what successful teaching looks like. And so, yeah, when an observer comes in and it looks like students are in little small groups and they're collaborating, that might look good. And the students might even be having an enjoyable time, but there's no substance to what they're doing. And I think that's why we're having such bad outcomes, because we've taken away even basic math skills like learning times tables is now considered controversial. Teaching phonics is controversial, and it's just insanity.
Absolutely. And learning sometimes might be boring. I mean, University of Chicago's slogan is where fun comes to die. And that's a great university, you know, but I think that we emphasize edutainment is what I call it, like what people call it, edutainment. Like, it's a circus act. I've heard teachers refer to it like it's like you're juggling in front of the classroom, and like the kids will never be. They have phones, they have technology. Like, we're fighting a losing battle with technology in the classroom. That's what teachers know. And it doesn't matter if you're jumping, you know, doing like running around in front of the room, like they don't care. And there's that disconnect. But it's like this emphasis on, is it entertaining? They'll use the word engaging, like, was your lesson engaging? But really, I think they mean, like, did it distract the students? It's so, I just think it's disingenuous what they're asking for, you know, in terms of that kind of edutainment. And I just could never do that. I felt like my content was ELA. It was stories. It was theme. It was textbook kind of stuff. And I was like, it might not be the most interesting thing in the world, but it doesn't necessarily have to be, was my thought. And then I was getting pushback from on high. It was just like, no, you need to make it just the most engaging lesson ever. It needs to be hands-on. There needs to be small groups. You need to have them doing gallery walks. You need to have them run around. And I just find it funny because a lot of these strategies that they tell teachers to do, like gallery walks and round robin and think, pair, share, like some of these strategies are literally kids walking around in circles. Like, we're going around in circles. Like, do you see how this might not actually be an effective learning strategy? And that's one of my bigger points, is that people are saying certain things are learning strategies when it's just their opinion. It's just an acronym that doesn't actually work. It's not based in any real understanding of what learning is. And I feel like a lot of people are talking in education who think they know something about what the learning process is, and they really don't. And they actually get book deals. And there's a large number of educational companies that are publishing what I really consider to be garbage about what should happen in a classroom. So I think that a lot of what K-12 education is now has been co-opted by what I call the professional development apparatus. And not to sound too conspiratorial, but really, like, I've done a lot of research. Now, I say real research, not the word research is thrown around too. Like, everyone says they have research. Like, I've just done some reading on what's going on in education, and there are a lot of people making claims about what should happen in the classroom that really don't know what they're talking about. Let me just give one quick example. Like pbis, everyone says pbis is an effective system. There's research, there's evidence about pbis. So I looked up the research. I'm like, I want to see what the research is. Okay. And what I found was they said PBIS might be effective in an elementary level classroom. Might. It was not even like a hard, like, this is a great program. I'm trying to remember the exact study, but it's there. All someone has to do is Google it. Please just start Googling. I think teachers need to start Googling every book that their administrator or the consultant gives them on PD. They need to look it up and see what it's actually saying. Like, actually read those books as much as you don't have time to do it, and how boring these books are about PD. Like, start reading them and you'll realize that it's actually just a bunch of garbage. It's like self-help platitudes. A lot of it is. But going back to the PBIS point real quick. So the PBIS, they say it could work in elementary, but you have consultants out there and administrators and everyone saying PBIS works everywhere. PBIS works in high school. PBIS works in college. They're even saying PBIS works for adults. And what PBIS is basically like a Chuck E. Cheese ticket system. Like, they're claiming it is like this amazing program. It's an app. It's an online portal where you log student behavior. And it's so funny because I've been watching a lot of this professional development, like these conferences, and what they'll do is, they make all these outrageous claims about how great these programs are, but then they'll also say, like, oh yeah, it's such a complex program and you need teachers to do it. But then they'll even say, oh no, the janitor can do it. They'll say the janitor can implement the PBIS program. And what, they'll say, oh, they can use a tier 2 intervention. The janitor who's getting paid minimum wage. Like, and again, how insulting is that to teachers, where like they're telling teachers, you need to implement this program, but if there's no teachers, then we'll just get the janitors to do it.
Wow. Yeah. And that kind of reminds me that I would find the schools would not even implement the PBIS programs correctly. Because, for example, in a lot of PBIS type reward systems, students could earn their way to something like a Fun Friday, a little party or whatever. But then we would have the administrators saying that everybody got to go and that nobody could be withheld. So even within the Pollyanna reward system, they're not even using that correctly. It's like turns into like a communist reward system where everybody gets the same thing regardless of behavior. It's insanity.
And teachers know this. Teachers are on the ground and they're being told, hey, implement this program. And teachers are like, hey, guess what? It doesn't work. And instead of like listening to the teachers, they're like, no, it does work. You just need to implement it with fidelity. They have all these buzzwords and fidelity is one of them. Fidelity basically means, did you do it exactly right? And the problem is that the program is so faulty to begin with that there's no way to implement it properly, because it's just, again, it's made up by certain, I think, companies, publishers who come up with an acronym, and these acronyms have been taking over education for decades. And what ends up happening is it's really just rebranding old concepts that also didn't really work. And I'll give one quick example. RTI was what was the rage in the 90s and the early 2000s. RTI stands for response to intervention. Guess what? They had a pyramid that looks exactly like the pyramid that MTSS uses nowadays, right? And so it's basically the same concept of RTI and MTSS, but what happens is even the consultants can't agree, because I've seen one educational consultant say, oh, RTI and MTSS are completely different programs. They're separate. Like, RTI didn't work. MTSS is completely different. But then there's another consultant who says, oh, actually, they're just the same thing. RTI and MTSS are actually the same thing. So the consultants and, these educational companies can't even agree on their basic programs. They don't even know what they are, because at the end of the day, the acronyms, I really believe, give an illusion of something being official and working. The acronyms really confuse the situation, because people will believe, oh, well, I don't even know what this acronym means, but if it's a system, it must work. And I really think that if teachers start to look into those programs that they're being told they must implement or else, I think teachers are going to find that those programs are actually very weak solutions for the big problems that we're facing in the classroom. PBIS, I remember when it was being implemented in my middle school, it was like such a joke. Everyone laughed at it. And, you could say, well, that's not fair to the program. But the program just didn't address the real issues that were happening in the school, like behavioral issues and academic issues. It just seemed like such a Band-Aid on a gaping wound to like throw like little pieces of paper at the situation. It was like, this isn't doing anything. Like they're claiming it is too. Like they're always saying there's evidence. Oh, you just need to do it. And if you don't do it, you're in trouble, which is what, teachers are told. And teachers are basically saying like, guys, these programs aren't really doing anything. Like they're not helping me on the ground in the classroom. And instead of being listened to, I really believe teachers are being gaslighted.
Definitely. And it kind of reminds me of the fact that a lot of these programs are built on a faulty premise. For example, a lot of the behavioral programs that we would get would say the only reason a student would misbehave is because they don't understand the direction. And so there was this really strange idea that, but did they really understand the rule? And I would say it's posted on the wall. I've had them do written reflections on it. We've had class discussions on it. I'm pretty sure I think they understand that you're not supposed to speak unless you've raised your hand while the teacher is in the front of the classroom. And so it's really bizarre. It's like these programs believe that kids will never misbehave for fun. They will never misbehave because of opportunity. And so it's just very strange. I don't know where these people come from and if they've ever actually taught in a classroom, but it's almost as if too, they don't believe that kids can be bullies to one another and just be mean because they can. And so
or sociopathic. I mean, it's like, we think that it's like this Pollyanna-ish approach, towards human behavior in general. And I really think that a lot of people in education just don't have a basic understanding of human behavior, child psychology. They'll make claims about it. But I think that there are larger things happening psychologically, and especially after COVID, things are really starting to fall apart, mental health issues and all this stuff. And I really don't think people understand like how a child's brain works and how they learn. And I feel like people, again, they just make so many assumptions about everything. Everything's an assumption, but then they claim that it's absolute hard truth. Where did this idea of student driven come from? Like they don't even, it's just this idea that it has to happen. And teachers will ask like, why? Like, why is this idea so prevalent? And again, it's just like an assumption that is really kind of coming out of nowhere. It's in science, they say it's like starting with the conclusion and working backwards. And I think that what's happening is a lot of people in education are starting from the conclusion. They say, student-driven works. Student-driven and project-based will help kids learn. That's just an assumption. That's just their opinion, But then they dress it up and say, oh, well, there's evidence and there's all this to prove it. But the evidence is definitely weak. And other fields, look at the field of education, especially when it comes to its research. And other fields are like, what are you guys doing? Like, how can you call this research? That you interviewed 4 kids about this, round robin strategy in an elementary classroom, and then you wrote a paper about it. That's not statistics. That's not evidence. That was, maybe it was commissioned by a company to prove that, this strategy works. So again, it's like, there's a conflict of interest there. There's a conflict of interest with the research because you're trying to prove your conclusion that, my program is the program that will work.
Yeah. And I think it goes back to the fact that it seems like modern schools cannot make up their mind about what the purpose for school is, because even using some of the round robin examples and some of the like goofy cooperative learning practices, if they want school to look like that, to be a feel-good, fun, therapeutic, so-called engaging environment, please make their tests and their assessments that way. But I remember the testing and the assessments got crazier and crazier as I was a teacher, and with Common Core and all these different standards, I was seeing, English language arts questions that I would have answered in high school in 6th grade. So it's like the tests are getting more rigorous, and the passages were long, they were difficult. And I'm thinking, we're not even allowed to have kids sit and read, in class and answer questions. We're doing all this fun cooperative stuff. So I would constantly ask, at what point are they actually training for the test? At at what point are they even getting the stamina to be able to do these tests? And so it doesn't make sense at all. They're constantly saying we want data, we want results, we want rigor, we want all of these outcomes, but then the very mechanisms to do that, they're saying, oh, we're not allowed to do that. That's old-fashioned teaching. And so I just think there's just this schizophrenia almost about what they actually want. And teachers are caught in the crosshairs. And to your point about gaslighting, it's such a vulnerable position to be in because most teachers need their paycheck. And I know from personal experience and from looking at other teachers that speak out, they get in trouble, they get punished, they get blacklisted. And so it's really weird. I think some teachers brainwash themselves so they don't even have to face the cognitive dissonance of the insanity of education. They just have to kind of pretend, oh yeah, this has to be right, this has to be true. But then I think there's so many more teachers in another category that they just can't stand up under the emotional weight of pretending, of lying, of faking, of doing things, especially for disadvantaged populations that they know will be destructive to their lives. And that's how I felt because, I mostly worked in Title I schools, and I know what it has taken me to get the success that I've gotten in my life. And I'm just thinking to myself, as a teacher who knows what it takes in real life to succeed, I'm setting these kids up for failure and I'm being applauded for it every day at work. And it's just a horrible feeling because contrary to popular belief, I think most teachers get in the field because they really want to educate students. They want to help the next generation to be literate, to be successful. But then every single roadblock imaginable is being set up to stop us from doing that. And so I think a lot of teachers are just leaving for that reason alone. They literally can't do their job on a day-to-day basis.
Absolutely. And I think that that's the key, because I think that we get so lost in the weeds with this moral question because it involves the kids. And it's like, we have to do something about the kids. And it's a moral question, right? And so this whole therapizing SEL stuff is basically like, we gotta meet the kids somewhere, But I think the best answer to all of this is to think about teaching as more of a technical question than it is a moral question. Because I think people get so lost in the platitudes, the idea about equity, that I think that it really should be a technical question of, can the teachers do their job or not? And have the kids learn something or not? And just start from there. Because we can hem and haw all we want about, oh, the kids can't read, but are we doing something to make sure that they can read? And it's a technical question, not a moral question. It's more, what are we doing to make the system better? But instead, I feel like the field has just been overridden with like these ideas about morality. I don't know, like that's a little ambiguous, but I just really feel like the SEL stuff is just so off the mark in terms of what the curriculum should actually be. And the curriculum should be knowledge-based. It should be knowledge-based. And if the kids don't know the knowledge of fourth grade, then they really shouldn't be passed on to fifth grade. And that will make the system work so much better, because then that fifth grade teacher can rely on the system. The fifth grade teacher will now know every student that they get in their classroom knows what they should have known from kindergarten through fourth. If that teacher is receiving kids who can't read, but now is expected to teach a fifth grade curriculum, it's not going to work. And to blame the teacher is deflecting from the bigger issue of this whole system where, it's all about passing the kids through. And it's not a perfect system. It's a system like the K-12 system was created in kind of like this industrial revolution assembly line mode, right? Where it's you pass something through and there's an end product at the end. And the end product is, a student who knows something, hopefully, right? But if in any other kind of situation, not to compare, like not to take like too simplistic an analogy, but I just use this analogy to kind of make my point. Like if you had a car factory that, went through the assembly line, you put the wheels on it, you put the steering wheel on it, you paint it, and you get it to the end of the assembly line and the car doesn't drive, then you might have a problem with the system. And you might want to go back and look at what's happening in the system to make this. And so not to simplify that kids are cars, I'm just saying like what we're getting is an end product that is lowering in quality every year, where we're graduating kids who haven't learned anything because they've sat there for 12 years thinking, I don't have to do anything, like they're going to pass me anyway. So they get to the end of the line, and then the hard reality of being 18 years old and going out into the real world finally hits. And what happens is these kids' behavior will not survive in the real world. If a kid gets a job at McDonald's as like a fry cook, and they're on their phone instead of like making the fries, they're going to get fired like almost immediately. But in school, that is just allowed. Like this kid can be on their phone all day. I remember one kid was watching HBO in my class. Like she just had no initiative, and she had her phone propped up behind her Chromebook, hiding and just watching Euphoria. And I'm like, what am I supposed to do? Like, if this kid won't work with me, what are we supposed to do? You know, and this kid really thinks like this is how things are going to be. Unfortunately, the real world is not that easy, because the second they get out and they get a real job, they're not going to be able to just tell authority off. Because right now, that's all they do. Like students really have this attitude thing where it's like they don't have to listen to anyone. And because of these trends in education, the student-driven trends, the kids get this false notion that, you know, they are the most valuable, and like their opinion matters the most. It doesn't matter what any adult tells them. And it's a disservice to kids because it's not giving them a realistic expectation of what the real world actually is like.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I just know for me, one of the most frustrating aspects of teaching is I've experienced both ways. I've had some years where, due to the administration or just the building I was in, I actually had freedom and they left me alone. And so when I had freedom and they left me alone for my English classes, we could easily get through 10 novels in one school year. And I genuinely saw students' test scores skyrocket. But then with different buildings or different admin, I was being told, oh, you're not allowed to have students read novels in class and to do the discussions and the writings. I want you to stand up in front of the class and read to them while they sit on the floor like they're in kindergarten and they listen to you. And I want you to have an anchor chart where you're pointing at pretty things. And that's going to be the key to student success. And I'm just thinking to myself, that's not even logical. That doesn't even make sense that in one model, students are reading and writing and thinking and communicating. And the other model, they're watching me do all of the work, and they're supposed to magically by osmosis have that knowledge transferred into their head. And so I just, I really can't imagine how a lot of veteran teachers deal with this, because they've seen so-called old-fashioned methods work and they're being forced to do these new ones. Test scores are plummeting and they're being gaslit into thinking that they are the problem. And it's just
absolutely. And I think that's why you're seeing the shortage, because what is happening is teachers feel like it's just untenable. It's not working. It would be like, as another example, like if you go to get your oil changed at the mechanics and the mechanic doesn't have oil, like you're going to blame the mechanic for not having the oil. Teachers aren't given the resources or the autonomy to do their job. They are constantly second guessed. They are constantly, told to do things one way when they know it would work a different way, but they're not trusted. So teachers aren't allowed to do their job. So that's why teachers ultimately leave, or it doesn't work out for them because they can't physically do the job with the horrible conditions that they face daily. They get blamed for it. And so any reasonable person at a certain point is going to say, this doesn't make sense. And you're asking me to really do the impossible, to be this kind of miracle worker, to do 10 different things that are not even related to what I signed up for. Like, people don't go into teaching. I think people, when they aren't in education, and maybe they're like, oh, I want to become a teacher, they don't know what will happen to them. They don't know that they have an idea of teaching, but there are so many people within the field who they're the gatekeepers. I really say, like, the gatekeepers of education are adamant that it is done a specific way. And if you go against that, they're going to fight you. They're going to say, you're a bad teacher. You are using outdated models. It turns out the outdated models like lecture and direct instruction are the only proven effective learning techniques. And that's really what these educational companies don't want to hear, because they have some kind of pyramid to sell you. I mean, a lot of it, I really do believe that the state of education, especially when it comes to the money, is it's pyramid scheme like, because everyone has a supposed solution. It sounds like an infomercial. This round robin strategy is going to be the thing that fixes it. And doesn't that just sound like an infomercial where they're selling you something? And teachers know it's not. It doesn't make sense, but the teachers aren't listened to. Instead, what happens is school districts listen to publishers who publish a lot of stuff about these acronyms and strategies. And then what happens is the administration hears it from the companies, and then the administration tells the teachers, this is what we're going to implement. And the teachers are like, well, it's not working. And so they're just gaslit, and they're told, oh, well, that's your fault then. It's your fault that this system that we're telling you to implement isn't working.
Yeah. I'm kind of reminded too, when you mentioned the pyramid scheme, it makes me think of Mary Kay because there's these top performers that can actually get their own pink Cadillac, and they have these crazy sales. And so like every normal salesperson is compared to like the people on the very top that are able to do it. And I think that happens so often in teaching. There's this mythical unicorn teacher, and who knows, maybe 1% of teachers are this mythical unicorn teacher with just the right personality and just the right degree of warmth and sternness and just the right connection with each kid and just the right illustrations. And they're just this amazing teacher, and they can do it. So it's like in every school district I've been in, it's like there's this one person that they point to and say, if they can do it, you can do it. And it's like, I don't think it works like that.
That's very disingenuous. It's like dishonest marketing, really, because it's trying to sell you something. And I think that's ultimately what's happening with K-12. If you follow the money, you're going to start to see that a lot of these strategies and kind of the professional development apparatus runs on gaslighting. I really believe that. And I have some research. I've been doing a lot of research in the past year and a half on it. So I know a lot of these companies now pretty well. Companies like Solution Tree. Companies that you've never heard of, even as teachers, because they don't want you to hear about them. I'm telling you, like, these companies they are very reticent to be known, because what they're doing is they're kind of pulling the strings behind the scenes with all of their supposed strategies. Again, these are companies, they're staffed by people who don't work in the classroom, so what ends up happening is you get these ideas coming from those companies in their books, like trickling down into teachers, like student driven or MTSS, and the teachers know that something doesn't seem right. But I really think if you just follow the money, what you'll start to see is that these companies are really kind of selling something to teachers, and the teachers aren't buying it. And that's like, they're always talking about teacher buy-in. They're always like, teacher buy-in, we need to get teacher buy-in. And it's like, well, the teachers are starting to realize that this stuff doesn't really work.
Absolutely. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about your story. At what point did you say, you know what, I am so done with teaching?
Well, so actually I was forced out. I was forced out because I quiet quit. And that's how I would put it, because I was in such a mental state working at a middle school that I was finding myself really suffering. My mental health was suffering. And it was that cognitive dissonance you were just talking about earlier, where it's like the expectations put on me were just so like massive. I had to do all things for all people at all times. And at the same time, these students that I was working with weren't doing anything. They weren't working with me. They made it so difficult for me to do my job that eventually I quiet quit at the time. And I look back on it now, and I have a better 2020 of what exactly happened. But in that quiet quitting, the district gave me poor performance reviews and said, hey, your pedagogy is bad, so like you're done. And so I made it 2 years at that middle school, and then they forced me to resign. And I look back on that now, and I realize that it really felt like I was getting the full blame for problems that were like, they weren't dealing with the behavioral issues. They were playing this kind of game of just like make believe, I felt, in terms of what the school, like how the school is functioning. And so when they went after like my pedagogy, I really feel like, well, I wasn't implementing the trends well enough. I wasn't doing student driven good enough, or whatever that means, But meanwhile, it was more like I couldn't physically do my job because the students refused to work with me. It was just like, I can only do so much. I can only bend over backwards so much and make this a circus act. And eventually it all just kind of fell apart. And so I was in education in various capacities over the years. In those 9 years, I taught in high school. I also did a GED program in the jails, actually. And I worked in a tech program as well. And so it was a lot of different experiences. But in each part of my career, I saw different things that were going wrong. Like in that tech program I was in, that was the personalized learning. It was just so bad because what it ended up being was just kids staring at their Chromebooks all day. Like there was so little academic rigor, or whatever you want to call it, like that was happening. And it was just like, oh, this is personalized learning. Like this is not working, And so I saw a lot of different bad things through my years. The behavior from the very beginning, when I started 12 years ago, the student behavior was just like, it was overwhelming. I was like, this is what kind of career decision. I'm surprised, like the fact that I made it through those first 2 years without quitting. I really did have almost like a mental kind of breakdown, I would argue, because it was so bad. I just had an identity crisis, because I was like, what have I gotten myself into in terms of this career? And I just, through sheer force, I got through it. I did get a better experience at a charter school for 3 years. And that did show me that there are still good schools out there. And shout out to Center for Academic Success, this charter school. 3 years, it was amazing because the students were very diligent, very serious, and administration backed their teachers. If there were any sort of behavioral issue, that student was gone. And it just made teaching possible. And some people will argue about the whole referral thing. What they'll say is, well, when you expel a student, you're denying them an academic, like an education. But there's a counter argument to that. And the counter argument is, well, if you keep that disruptive student in the system, guess what? They're going to take away from the academic, success of other students, because it's an all or nothing thing. So if you keep the kids who don't take the process seriously within the system, eventually they gain this like momentum, and the whole process grinds to a halt because you have so much disruption in behavior that you can't actually teach. So at the charter, where the charter actually had the ability to just say, all right, these students are expelled, I was able to teach, and it felt like a normal job. It felt like I have a textbook, I have a lesson, I have students who are listening, students who are working. It's not rocket science to me. It was never it never had to be such a difficult thing in the first place to teach. And again, I think that a lot of people within the profession, they say, oh, teaching is this complex, and it's like you're saving lives. Again, with all the moral kind of like platitudes, like you're saving kids' lives and you're doing this and you're doing that. And at the end of the day, I really think it should be viewed more as a job, just like other jobs. And that's not to say it's not important. There are so many jobs are important, and I think teaching is one of them. But I think it should be seen more as kind of a technical endeavor in which it matters more that the system works, the kids learn something, and they are prepared for the real world. Because right now, what we're preparing all these kids to believe that there is no authority, that they never have to work, that everything will be easy, everything will be entertainment, all these different things that we're really kind of giving the lesson to kids. That's the lesson they're getting from the system right now. They're not getting the lesson about, getting more academic rigor or whatever. They're not getting to the higher order thinking. And just one quick point I want to make about Bloom's taxonomy, because it's such a big concept in education. What is happening right now is that the bottom of the Bloom's taxonomy is just like basic information and facts. That is where we need to start. But what happens is everyone emphasizes the top of the pyramid, the like higher order thinking skills. You can't have those higher order thinking skills without the bottom of the pyramid. And what we're doing is we're pushing kids through who don't get any knowledge at the very beginning, and then expecting them to think metacognitively and think on such a deep level when they get in the higher grades. The problem is the kids never learned any knowledge, like the memorization, the kind of boring stuff, basic facts about history, basic facts about where they live, basic facts about math. They don't get that because there's such an obsession with the top of the pyramid that there's no base. And without the base, this is why you're seeing so many problems. The behavioral issues are because the system is definitely not working and something has to change. So we can hem and haw about, oh, the behavior's bad, teachers are leaving, all we want, but it's because there are actually solutions to it. But again, I think a lot of people are offering solutions, but that they're offering solutions and they don't know anything about learning. They don't know anything about actual classroom, like what the classroom is like right now. They just have all these ideas that aren't doing anything for any teachers. And so, it's all kind of connected, the teacher shortage, all of this stuff. I really think if teachers start doing a Google search on a lot of these companies, they'll start to realize what really kind of the con is.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad that you had that 3 years of a good experience, because nobody can gaslight you out of that and say, oh, you're just a bad teacher. Because no, in the right environment, there are so many teachers that could be wildly successful that are being gaslit into thinking they're failures right now. And I feel the exact same way. I've had years where I was left alone and I was able to be massively successful with what I know works, but those other years where I had somebody else like breathing in my ear all the time and telling me all the things I was doing wrong, those were the worst years and the least enjoyable years. So I'm kind of wondering, is there anything about teaching that you did find fulfilling and joyful as a whole, or did all of the bad stuff just kind of make the career miserable as a whole?
Well, I think that to answer that question, I would say when I was able actually to teach, like when I could teach, teaching is a very fulfilling experience. The problem is there's so many other things that are happening that you find yourself not able to teach, whether it's the behavior or whether it's what's coming from on high. Like when you're actually able to have that connection, read something that you love and then to kind of share that love with students, like that's awesome. And again, in that charter, I was able to do that. I was able to pick books that I love. We read those books and we got something out of it. And so it is possible to, like, I think teaching itself is actually enjoyable. The term teaching, but the problem is in education that teaching is so many different things to so many different people. And some people see teaching as therapizing. They see it as like, again, the social emotional aspect, like relationships and all that stuff. And I don't think it's all that. I think it should be more of the academic, kind of direction. And, so there are positives. There's definitely positives. It's just there's so few and far between in many ways because you are just fighting really a losing battle with so many different things that are happening in the classroom, in the school, that you find yourself really having that kind of crisis because you're like, I go in every day and I can't implement these lessons. What am I doing? Like, I cannot work in this sort of environment. It's so difficult. And you start to really lose hope in the whole process. But I think that teaching itself is enjoyable if it can be done right, so there are positives. It's like I try not to get too negative, but the positives are there for sure. And it's just like if we can get back there. And I think that what I'm saying with a lot of what I'm saying right now is like the solutions are there, but the solutions are not what some people want to hear. Like the solutions are getting the gradation system under control, where we just have to stop passing kids. We have to. If we don't stop passing kids, the system will continue to get worse. And if we would just implement a solution like that, then things would immediately get better, I believe. But it's like, when are we going to take the initiative and do that? When are we going to focus on a more knowledge-based curriculum as opposed to what we're doing right now, which is a lot of character ed? And again, it's like, what does the kid know at the end of those 12 years? Do they know more advanced work, or do they have they just been kind of slacking off for 12 years?
Yeah. And I think we have to find a way to get back to students and their families having ownership of their education. Because I think what happens when you have a culture and a society and people that do not value education or knowledge, that is why they're trying to just make everything fun. And you don't see that as much in other countries. Families instill in their kids the meaning of having a valuable education. And so at least a lot of the places that I worked, I felt like the kids and their families didn't care. And I think even in the old days, so to speak, parents had an investment because they didn't actually want their kid to be held back 3 times. There was some kind of pressure on the families to work with the school. But even when I was teaching, slowly there was more and more of a push for there to be no kind of homework. There's just any kind of way that there would be accountability. It was completely lacking. And so it just keeps going back to this theme of all the pressure being placed on teachers. And it's like, I can't sit in that kid's chair and take the test for them. I can't go to college for them. I can't think for them. I can't care for them. And so I think as long as this, all the blame is put on the teachers, there's just no way that things are going to get any better. So I'm kind of curious, in your experience, at the beginning, did you think that there was something wrong with you, or did you kind of know from the get-go that there was something broken with the system?
Well, what I would argue about that is that I feel that I was actually somewhat indoctrinated. And I know that sounds kind of crazy to say, but I think that it's kind of like an inadvertent indoctrination in terms of all these trends, because basically from the second you start, you have these ideas about, I'm going to lecture, I'm going to do it's going to be like this romantic ideal of what education is, like teaching. It's going to be Dead Poet Society. I'm going to be in the front of the room and these kids are going to be so excited about learning. And so those ideas like kind of get co-opted by the trends. You're told you need to do it this way. You need to do small groups, you need to do student driven. So right away, they start kind of telling you what to do. And if you don't do it that way, they really make your life hard. So, from the very beginning, you go to trainings, you go to conferences, they force you, it's all mandated. Like professional development, I believe it really is designed to change the way teachers think about teaching, to think of it more in the way they want you to think about it. So a lot of these ideas in professional development, what they're doing is they're convincing you, they're really kind of selling you on these ideas like, oh, PBIS works, So I think that what ends up happening is, it, like, to use the word indoctrination is a little harsh, but I really think that if anything, it really makes you question what you thought teaching was. And so you get into this kind of vulnerable state where you don't really know. Like you start to get confused, and that's where they can start selling you the trends, So I really believe that the field of education has so many trends to sell you as a teacher that, again, it's like you're second guessed. Your expertise doesn't really matter. Like there's always a consultant that's going to tell you how to do your job. And that's one of the most frustrating things about the field. And it's just like constant second guessing. Like I just felt like in my career overall, it was always like I wasn't trusted. Like I was like, it was just like being in the classroom as an ELA teacher, there was always someone, and I think the observations don't help with this, because you never know like what an administrator is going to say about your lesson, and they always have an opinion. And that's not to say to like, it's important to get better. I do believe in like getting better as a professional, but at a certain point, that professional needs to be allowed to do their job. And what I found was, even with experience, even with, my own content knowledge, I was not trusted to do it. And so when I was teaching in the classroom, I just constantly felt like someone was always telling me how to do it. And more often than not, it was the trends. It was, do a gallery walk, put some posters up. Anchor charts is the big thing now. Anchor charts. You need anchor charts up on the walls. And again, it's just like, why? I don't, these ideas are coming from somewhere and they just aren't helping the situation. So kind of to get back to that idea though, like I just feel that it's kind of a slow burn in terms of what professional development does, because it's over time that they get you with these ideas. So I think what ended up happening with me is I really had kind of an identity crisis in terms of what my teaching was, because I was being told from all different directions I was doing it wrong. Everything I was doing didn't make sense, when really it was the problem of the school and the problem of the behaviors. But it was being put on me that it must have been my pedagogy. And I think that that's one of the biggest issues, is that teachers are a scapegoat. They're an easy scapegoat in a way, because they're the ones in the classroom. They're the ones who are trying to fix this broken system. They can't. They leave or are forced out, like I was. And, nothing really changes. The acronyms change, the trends change, but the problems just continue. I do want to kind of address how the reading crisis, and that has to do with like the more recent reporting on Sold the Story, Emily Hanford and Fountas and Pinnell and Lucy Calkins, because I really believe that's a part of the story as well.
Yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on it as a fellow English teacher.
For sure. So the reading crisis has been decades in the making. And, if you do, I suggest teachers do some research. I'm sure a lot of teachers have already heard Emily Hanford's podcast, Sold a Story, and all this stuff about Lucy Calkins and her units of study, which have proven to be, just a joke. And what Emily Hanford discovered in Sold a Story was that really the whole language model of the past 30 years has not taught kids how to read. Now, this is where one of our biggest issues with the whole field comes into play, because what is happening is when the kids don't learn how to read at an early age and then are pushed through the system, the learning cannot happen. Because as an ELA teacher, I know that if you're not reading, you're not learning. And so if the kids can't take in content, the learning process is very limited. And so really we're kind of seeing kind of the latest developments in this story, where Phonics was really kind of discouraged for so long. Phonics was considered, again, it's like that basic, that's the bottom of Bloom's taxonomy. Like, you don't want to go to Phonics. That's too basic. It's like, actually, you have to start from the basic bottom of the pyramid in order to get to the higher levels. But so the reading crisis really does help explain a lot of the other problems that we're seeing in education, all the other issues, you know, the behavior and all that stuff, because we're seeing it's really decades in the making. I mean, there was a book published in like the 50s called Why Johnny Can't Read. And it was talking about the move away from phonics. Like what happened in the 60s and 70s in K-12 education was a move away from phonics and a move into what is called whole language. Now, Emily Hanford talks a lot about that too. But basically, it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about just people with opinions. Like a lot of people had opinions about what reading instruction should be like, but they really weren't, qualified to have those opinions. You know, an example is the program Reading Recovery. You know, Emily Hanford gets a lot into that. You know, Reading Recovery is a program that doesn't work. It didn't teach the kids how to read. Fountas and Pinnell, the LLI boxes, that were being sold to schools. I know my middle school had those, books, and it doesn't work. And now Fountas and Pinnell and Lucy Calkins are under the microscope because of those failed reading programs. But the failed reading programs lead to the other issues. As a teacher, as an ELA teacher in high school, I was getting kids who couldn't read, and I was just like shocked. I was like, this kid can't read a sentence, let alone the novel that I would like to teach him. So it was just, again, more cognitive dissonance. So here's my job. My job is to, work with these students on some basic ELA skills. And I wasn't even able to do that because their reading levels were so low getting into the high school. And one of my biggest mistakes, I think, in my career was never thinking about what was going on at the elementary level. I didn't know that what was happening down there was so, it was so detrimental to the learning process because the kids weren't getting the basics, that when they were finally pushed up to me, I was seeing the results of years of really neglect, like academic neglect, where then it was on me, like, oh, this is your problem now. Like, you better teach these kids how to read. And I was just like, I'm so limited. And again, and then on the other side of it is the professional expectations and the rigor that they're looking for in the curriculum. So you're given a 10th grade curriculum that is extremely advanced for these kids, and you're told, implement this. And you are just sitting there as a teacher, like, these kids can't even read a sentence. They can't write a sentence. And you want me to get them to write an essay? It's very unrealistic expectations. And again, I think it stems from the reading crisis that has been really just worsening for the past 50 years, and it started a long time ago. I think that the research, or I should say the reporting right now, is showing where it is right now in 2024. But it's kind of obvious now. You just look at the proficiency levels of the test, the real data that we have about how bad the reading scores are. And we know that something is very wrong. And I think that reporters like Emily Hanford are just kind of starting to find out what is going on with K-12 education.
Definitely. I think it's so hard too, because at least when I was an ELA teacher, I only taught 4th through 8th grade. So I was never at the really early levels, but the kids, just like you, would come to me, usually an average of 1 to 3 years behind. And we were constantly told, well, you need to differentiate instruction. You need to pull small groups. You need to be teaching those phonics skills, to your 6th and 7th graders in the small group format. And it was just really weird because it's like teachers were expected to have the skill and expertise to essentially teach what they should have learned in, kindergarten through 3rd grade. And we were supposed to be somehow one-on-one individually doing this with students that were behind, which in my case was upwards of 70% of the class was anywhere between 1 and 3 grade levels behind, while teaching grade level curriculum, while doing all of, the crazy small groups. And we want to see kids rotating, and we want to see, all of this engagement. And so it's just absolutely impossible, like you said. So are you happier now that you are not in a traditional teaching role?
I am happier. And I really do feel like I'm almost deprogrammed after those 9 years. And again, it was various experiences in my career, working in the jails and all this different stuff. Getting out of it, I really do feel like I'm getting deprogrammed, because after I left, I was so confused by all the acronyms. And that's where I really started doing some research. I was like, what does any of this even mean? Like, I'm being told MTSS, all this stuff. And I was really upset at how I was, forced out too, because I felt it was really unfair. I did feel it was unfair how they fired me, because they were blaming my performance, when I really think that it wasn't just me. I think a lot of teachers were in my same situation, and they were just being told to kind of sit there and take it. So I was pretty bitter, and I still have maybe a little resentment towards that situation. But leaving it was probably the best thing for me, because I could deprogram and I could start to see what happened. Like, 9 years, I use the word indoctrination, and I don't use that word lightly. I really believe that getting into the career, they really kind of do a number on you, where you start to believe in the acronyms. You start to believe in all these different strategies. You don't know what it really means to teach, and you just are listening to the people who are telling you, the consultants. Everyone has an opinion to tell you. And so leaving was the best thing for me, because I could then divorce myself from all those ideas. And I started to realize, wow, so much of this stuff just is garbage. Like, again, and Rita Kramer's book, Ed School Follies, is a great book, and I recommend teachers read it. It came out a long time ago. It came out in like 1991, but it shows kind of the beginnings of these ideas that form starting in ed school, of all these different strategies that really ultimately don't work. But it just shows kind of really what I think is a doctrine, as opposed to any sort of actual research. And so, having left the field, I am now able to see that. I'm able to see, oh, this is why it was so difficult for me. This is why I was getting blamed for so much. And so now I really do feel like this, like, weight off my shoulders, that I can look at it with kind of an objective view. And Emily Hanford's story, when I heard that podcast, it all started clicking for me as an ELA teacher. I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. The kids never learned how to read. It was so obvious. It was like, oh my gosh, like, here I am just struggling, like just having the hardest time in my career decision. I'm like, what did I do? Why did I choose this career? And then I finally start doing a little research, and I start to find, oh, this is why everything is so bad. And I started to find also, I really believe that it's money. I really believe that certain people are making money off of this disaster. And just like one small point, Naomi Klein wrote a book called Disaster Capitalism. And the book is about how there are certain people who take advantage of bad situations, monetarily speaking. And I really believe our school system is a product of that. I really believe what is happening with our schools is a product of that disaster capitalism, because the schools are such a mess that now you get all these companies like vultures, circling the carcass that is the K-12 education system, and saying, like, how can I make money off it? And guess where the money is? In technology, in the, making sure everyone gets a Chromebook. Everyone has, all these apps that are edutainment, whatever, Kahoot, and like, there's nothing wrong with Kahoot. I'm just saying, like, it's these ed companies that say, oh, well, guess what? The answer is screens, and so you have like LAUSD, Los Angeles, a few years ago had a very public initiative with iPads, and it failed miserably, but they spent like billions of dollars on it, to get an iPad in the hands of every student. Turns out that wasn't the solution. What did Los Angeles think? Like, oh, if we just give every kid an iPad, suddenly they'll start learning. Turns out it was to make money, of course, because it always comes down to the money, I would think, that these ed companies and the tech companies make money off of the chaos. I really believe that. I really believe that it is a form of disaster capitalism.
Absolutely. I'm kind of curious, did you ever find support or help with other teachers? Because I've had mixed experiences, and I've heard mixed experiences from other places. I feel like in some buildings, the culture is teachers are even afraid to talk amongst each other. So they all kind of act like brainwashed minions. But then there's other places where teachers kind of whisper to each other, and they know everything is a scam and it's a joke, and they kind of support each other. So what kind of experience did you have with other adults in the building?
Well, I've definitely had positive experiences with colleagues, and, the commiseration almost, like, of, wow, this doesn't make sense. And so, but it was almost like the teachers were allied against administration, and that's not healthy. It shouldn't be like that, where it feels like there's different competing camps. And I've seen a lot of that. And I've also seen, like, just outright, like, what I would call psychological warfare, where I felt untrusted. I felt alone, working in a school. Like, my first school was just so bad because I was new and I just was in not a good state. And I felt that the people around me, they tried, and I tried to connect with them, but there were so many problems, and like, it was just like classroom management issues every day. And so, like, colleagues are like trying to say, oh, why don't you try this? And why don't you try that? And I'm just like, I don't know what's going on. Like, this is so bad. Like, you tell me to try this and it doesn't really work. And I'm just like having a hard time. I'm like not in a good state. So, it's kind of run the extremes of like whether I've had good colleagues or bad colleagues, but I have definitely had good colleagues. And that charter school where I felt supported, I felt that there was a network of teachers, and our principal was a good leader. She ran the school well. And so those relationships were very important. But on the other end of it, like in my more recent job at the middle school, yes, I did have collegial relationships, I think. But at the same time, I felt that there were camps. Again, there were factions, political power, political infighting, and the people with the trends and the people with the strategies were the ones who were, making the decisions. And so, they were just kind of making it much more difficult to kind of feel comfortable or happy in the building, because it felt like work was just so miserable in so many different ways. You have students like just running amok, like students in the halls, it's just chaos. I mean, for lack of a better word, it just truly is chaos. And so you enter that building early in the morning, and it's just immediately you're just confronted with like just anarchy. And then you're trying to survive in this kind of mess that is happening in front of you. And it's just not good for your mental health, as a lot of teachers, I think, know, especially in more difficult schools, like whatever Title I or whatever you want to call it, like city schools or whatever. The problems that you see in those schools are just so overwhelming for any reasonable person. And so I think any person who, looks at the situation objectively would say that is not a good place to put someone and then blame them for those problems. And I think that's what happens with schools, is that the people who get employed by them, face these really overwhelming odds and then are told, fix it, be a miracle worker, like make it work, So I think that that's really kind of what's happening.
Definitely. Well, I guess the final question that I'll ask you is, what do you wish society as a whole knew about a teacher's job? Because there's been a lot of backlash against teachers, I think, especially post 2020. So what do you just wish people understood about a teacher's job?
Well, what I would first say is I hope people can come out of this saying that, teaching is a job. It's not like a moral imperative necessarily, or it shouldn't be. I think that it should be viewed more in a way that it is kind of a technical thing, where we have adults who are charged with teaching our next generation, and we should trust those adults to do it and not get so lost in the moral question, the platitudes about, saving the kids or whatever. I think if we start from the technical question of how can we make the system better and how can we make the learning process more functional, I think that's the beginning of it. And I hope people would look at teaching as it's definitely a difficult job, but it doesn't have to be so difficult. It really doesn't. I think if we implement some simpler solutions that might not make people money, but actually will fix things, then more people will want to be teachers. Because right now, I think that the profession itself is very derided by other, outsiders. They're like, well, you might just be a glorified babysitter or whatever, right now it's looked down upon. I really think so. And I don't think it needs to be. I think it can actually be a good job. I don't think it has to be so bad as it is right now. And I really do hope that we can, work together to make it better. And I just think that people need to kind of reassess, especially parents. I think parents need to reassess what's going on inside your kid's school. I think that parents, I did see some disengagement, but I just think that they're confused as well. I think that parents are confused by all the stuff that the schools are telling them too, because if a parent sees those acronyms, they don't know what that means. They don't know what MTSS means. And so they just kind of assume, oh, okay, then I guess that's what they're doing now, not realizing that, oh, it turns out their kids haven't learned anything yet. Their kids haven't gotten any knowledge in the school, it's kind of like that meme. It's like, you had one job, the schools have one job. It's to teach the kids, and they're not doing it. It's just kind of remarkable that I think we need to simplify it and say, okay, what do we really expect teachers to do? And again, they're not supposed to be miracle workers. They're not supposed to be babysitters. They're not supposed to be therapists. They're not supposed to be any and all, all these things. A teacher should be, conveying important knowledge to kids. Full stop. Let's simplify the situation, and then maybe we will have a chance of making the situation better for everyone, for the parents, for the kids, for the teachers, even for the administrators. I know, you talk a lot of, I say a lot about administrators, but I think that everyone is kind of in the same boat because we're all just kind of struggling. I struggle too. What makes a good curriculum? I think that's a hard question to answer for a lot of people. It's not an easy question. What should the kids be learning? That actually is a pretty deep question. But again, I think if we just start kind of taking it back and saying we need to simplify it, and we need to really reassess everything, then I think we will make the job better for the teachers who are still there and make it a little more appealing to getting people back into education. Because right now, I don't think people aren't lining up to become teachers because they literally see the videos every day on TikTok. You know, they see what happens in schools and they're like, no, thank you.
Absolutely. Well, this has been an awesome interview, Quentin. Thank you so much. And audience, thank you so much for watching. If you have questions for either of us, make sure to type them in the comment box. If you have any ideas for future videos, let me know. And if you want to interview with me, you can email me at teachertherapytrish@gmail.com. Thank you guys again for subscribing and watching, and we'll see you guys next time. Bye for now, everyone.